Let's piss some people off.
There comes a point in healing where people start saying you changed, but what they really mean is you stop reacting the way you used to. You stopped begging for clarity. You stopped chasing people. You stopped over explaining yourself. You stopped accepting behavior that drains you just because you were afraid to lose someone. And honestly, that version of you was never peace. That version of you was survival mode. Hi, and welcome back to I Am Spice, the podcast, where we talk about healing, identity, emotional growth, relationships, self awareness, and becoming the version of yourself that no longer abandons who they are just to be accepted. If you've been enjoying the podcast, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, share the episode, and follow the journey because these conversations are becoming bigger than just a podcast now. I think one of the strangest parts about healing is realizing how many relationships were built around the unhealed version of you. And I'm not even talking about romantic relationships. I mean friendships, family dynamics, work relationships, even the way strangers interact with you sometimes. Because when you're disconnected from yourself, people get used to certain versions of you. The version of you that tolerated too much, the version that stayed quiet to avoid conflict, the version that overexplained everything because they were terrified of being misunderstood, the version that constantly gave people access, chances, understanding, patience, empathy, even when those same things were rarely given back. And for a long time, you don't even realize you're doing it because it becomes your normal. Especially if you grew up feeling like love had to be earned, like peace had to be maintained, like easy to deal with was safer than being brutally honest. A lot of people learn very young that survival means adapting to everybody else's emotion while ignoring their own. This is really sad, and that becomes really, really exhausting. Not overnight exhaustion, not the kind that goes away after you go to sleep. I'm talking about emotional exhaustion. The kind where you wake up one day and realize you spent years abandoning yourself trying to keep everybody else comfortable. That's usually where healing starts. Not in some beautiful inspirational moment, not because you suddenly became confident, not because life magically got easier. Healing usually starts after disappointment, after emotional burnout, after too many situations that force you to finally ask yourself, why am I always the one carrying the emotional weight of everything? And slowly, your reactions start changing. Not dramatically at first. You just stop arguing as much. You stop trying to convince people to understand you. You stop feeling the need to explain every boundary. You stop chasing closure from people who clearly don't want accountability. You stop forcing connections that constantly leave you emotionally drained. And honestly, that shift confuses people because people are comfortable with the version of you that overextends themselves. The version that always answers immediately, the version that always fixes things, the version that apologizes first, the version that keeps giving chances no matter how many times they're disappointed. So when healing changes your behavior, people notice immediately. And that's usually when the comments usually start. Comments like, you changed, you're different, you used to be softer, You used to care more. You're distant now. But what nobody talks about enough is that healing is supposed to change you. You're not supposed to stay the same after becoming more self-aware. You're not supposed to keep tolerating things that hurt you once you finally recognize the patterns. And I think a lot of people confuse boundaries with attitude. That has happened to me a lot, especially when they benefited from you and your lack of boundaries before. Because now you're calmer, but more observant, less reactive, harder to guilt, harder to pressure, harder to emotionally manipulate. And people often hate this. Not because you became cold, but because your nervous system stopped operating from survival mode all the time. That eventually happens. And that's a huge difference. Some people think healing means becoming this perfectly peaceful person who never gets triggered. Oh, yes, we do. Never feels hurt, never struggles emotionally anymore just because you're healed. That's not true. That is so not realistic because we're still human. Healing is not becoming emotionless. Healing is becoming aware, knowing where you stand. It's realizing that not every argument deserves your energy. Not every misunderstanding deserves a paragraph. Not every relationship deserves unlimited access to you. People hate that too. And honestly, the realization changes everything, because once you stop abandoning yourself to keep people comfortable, some relationships naturally start shifting. And that can feel lonely at first. Oh, it does feel lonely. Especially when you're used to being the person who constantly overgives emotionally. A lot of people don't realize how uncomfortable healing can actually feel in the beginning, because your nervous system was so used to chaos, overthinking, fixing, proving, chasing, explaining. That peace almost feels unfamiliar at first. Silence feels unfamiliar. Boundaries feel unfamiliar. Saying no without guilt feels unfamiliar. I've been there way too many times. Even resting can feel unfamiliar when you spent years emotionally surviving instead of actually living. And honestly, that realization is part of why I became so passionate about creating spaces like the House of Spies. Because I think that so many women are emotionally exhausted from constantly performing strength, performing okayness, performing healing, while secretly carrying so much emotional pressure internally. And sometimes people don't need another place to perform. They just don't. They need spaces where they can breathe, where they can laugh, exist softly, feel safe, feel understood without needing to explain every part of themselves. I think that's something so many people are craving right now. I know I do. We're not craving perfection, not performance, we're not pretending. We just want emotional safety. And the truth is, once you finally experience emotional safety, whether it's through friendships, community, healing, self-awareness, or simply becoming more connected to yourself, you start realizing how many environments were draining you before. You start noticing how much energy you used to spend managing other people's emotions. You start realizing how much of your life was spent trying to avoid disappointing people. And eventually, you stop wanting to live that way. that doesn't mean you stop loving people. That doesn't mean you became selfish. That doesn't mean you stopped caring. It just means you finally start including yourself in the care of that you give everybody else. And honestly, that changes people, especially people who were only comfortable with the version of you that tolerated everything. Because growth changes relationship dynamics. It always does. We hope it doesn't, but it always does. Some people will grow with you. Some people will misunderstand you. Some people will take your boundaries very personally. Some people will accuse you of changing simply because they no longer benefit from unlimited access to you. Listen to that again. Some people will accuse you of changing simply because they no longer benefit from unlimited access to you. Write that down. But that doesn't mean your healing is wrong. It just means your healing disrupted familiar patterns. And I think that's important to remember because a lot of people carry guilt after growth. They feel guilty for saying no, guilty for pulling away, guilty for protecting their peace, guilty for no longer being emotionally available to everyone 24/7. But protecting your peace is not cruelty. Having boundaries is not cruelty. Wanting emotional healthy relationship is not asking for too much. And maybe that's the biggest lesson healing teaches you. You can love people deeply and still recognize when certain dynamics are unhealthy for you. That's something that you gotta think about. You can care about people and still stop abandoning yourself. It's a must. You can't be compassionate without becoming self-destructive. And honestly, I think a lot of us are learning that for the first time in our life, the truth is healing doesn't always make your life louder. Sometimes it makes you quieter. It makes you more intentional, more observant, more aware, more selective with your energy, who you spend time with, aware, more protective of your peace. And maybe that's not a bad thing because maybe you didn't become harder to love. Maybe you just became harder to manipulate. If this episode resonated with you, share with someone who's been struggling with guilt after growth. And if you've ever been told that you have changed after finally choosing yourself, I want you to know and I want you to remember something. Maybe changing was the healthiest thing you ever did for yourself. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for growing with me through every session and version of this journey. I'll see you guys on the next episode of I Am Spice the podcast. Love you bunches.
And remember, we're unfiltered, unapologetic, and unstoppable. That's that.